Hi friends, welcome to Beautifully Bookish Bethany. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing my favorite horror, mystery, and thriller books that I read in 2021. Yes, it is time for yet another end of year favorites list, and this time we're talking about horror, mystery, and thrillers. One note is that these are my favorites of the books that I read in 2021, not necessarily all books that were published in 2021, although several of them were published in 2021. Another note is that this is just adult titles I've read. I'm not including any YA. If you want to see my favorite picks for YA, I will link my best YA of 2021 video up above. That video does include some horror, mystery, and thriller novels, as well as other genres. But for today's video, I'm going to be talking about my top 14 adult titles in these genres that I read in 2021. Coming in at number 14 is not a book that got the highest rating from me, but it is certainly something that left an impression, and it feels like a big accomplishment to have read this. This is House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. This book was a trip. I am not usually one who annotates my books, but this one I definitely did. And if you are at all interested in seeing my spoilery descent into madness with this book, I will link the lengthy reading vlog that I made up above. This was a journey, and I can see why this is a polarizing book. There are people who adore this, there are people who hate this. I liked it quite a lot. I ended up giving it 4 stars. It's not a new favorite for me necessarily, but I think it is one that has stuck with me, and I think there's a reason that this is a notorious, well-known book in the horror genre. If you haven't read House of Leaves before, it's a little tricky to explain, but basically it's a story within a story within a story, where basically this guy finds a manuscript written by a dead guy, and he's reading the manuscript. You're also reading his notes on the manuscript and things about his life as he's reading it. And then the manuscript itself is almost like an academic study of a supposed movie that a family made of themselves moving into a house that has some strange things going on with it. So it's weird, it's complicated, it's kind of labyrinthine, and the formatting is unusual. Kind of a quick flip through there. So this was House of Leaves. Again, not necessarily my favorite horror book that I read in 2021, but one that felt like a big accomplishment and certainly left an impression on me. Number 13 was Final Girls by Riley Sager. This is a thriller that's also kind of a take on the slasher genre. It follows a young woman who had survived a mass murder, kind of like something you'd see in a slasher film, but things are getting weird again. And I really like this. I feel like Riley Sager's books in general tend to be polarizing, and different books are hit and miss for different people, but I thought this one was pretty good. It was a fun read. I liked the twist at the end, and it did manage to surprise me a little bit. I didn't see everything coming. I don't want to say more than that because I don't want to spoil it, but I quite liked this one. Number 12 is The Good Sister by Sally Hepworth. This is kind of an interesting take on a domestic thriller where it's about sisters instead of a married couple. This was one of the books that we read for my Patreon book club, and I feel like most people liked it pretty well. It's another one that's a little tricky to talk about without giving anything away, but it follows 2 sisters who have kind of a complicated relationship and a dark past, and one of them really wants to have a baby, but like whether she would be a good mother is questionable. The other sister, it's not named on the page, but I think she's intended to be somewhere on the autism spectrum given the way that she's written. And I loved her. I thought she was such a great character, and this book definitely had some interesting twists and turns and did a lot looking at toxic family relationships. And yeah, I don't want to say too much more than that, but I really liked this, and I think it creates some interesting discussion points. Coming in at number 11 is a literary horror novel. This is The Book of Accidents by Chuck Wendig. This one is also pretty genre bending, but I'm putting it in this list. I read this for a reading vlog in December where I was trying to find some new favorite books before the end of the year. It was a pretty successful reading vlog, and this, even though this didn't make my favorites list, it was still one that I really liked. If you haven't seen that video and you're at all interested, I will link it up above. You can hear more of my in-the-moment thoughts on this book. But this is a book that has really grown on me the more that I think about it. When I first finished it, I had kind of mixed feelings because I think it did some things in the second half of the book where there's a big tonal shift that I wasn't expecting. It went in kind of a sci-fi direction, I guess I'll put that, which I didn't anticipate, but the more I think about it, the more I like it, and the more I want to go back and reread it at some point. And this is a book that does deal with some heavier themes and can get quite graphic. It's dealing with cycles of trauma and abuse in relationships, and what do we pass on to our children? How do we break those cycles, or what if we perpetuate them? And how do we respond to trauma in our lives? I think it's dealing with some heavy issues, but some really good ones. It follows a family who's moving back into the home that the dad grew up in, and there's some weird stuff going on. I won't say too much more than that, but this is definitely horror, although it is literary. It's slower paced, it's more character driven, and it's got a lot of interesting themes that it's focusing on, but with that genre bending element. So again, not a perfect book. I do think it's longer than it needs to be. It comes in at like 500 pages, and I don't really think it needed to be that long, but I did like this, and it's one that's continued to grow on me. Number 10 is another book that I read for that reading vlog project looking for new favorites. This is Madam by Phoebe Wynne. This is a little bit of a controversial pick, and I can understand why. Not everybody loves this, and don't get me wrong, I think there are valid criticisms to be made of this book. I don't think it's a perfect book, but it was very much my kind of book. I loved it. I ate this book up. It was exactly what I wanted it to be. Even though I can see the shortfalls, I still really love it a lot and wanted to put it on this list. Madam is a gothic mystery thriller following a new teacher starting at an elite girls' boarding school in Scotland, where there are some dark and weird things going on. Now, is this book a little bit on the nose in the way that it deals with things it wants to tackle, like misogyny and abuse and things like that? Yes, it totally is, but I just loved it. I had such a good time with this book. It hit all the tropes I like. It's got that super gothic atmosphere to it. It's got weird dark secrets under the surface that do get quite dark, so if you need content warnings, check those out. And yeah, I was really into this. So again, not going to be everybody's cup of tea, but it really, really worked for me. And I will say, I think horror and thrillers in particular are genres where people have such different taste in what they do and don't like in books. And so because of that, these kinds of books tend to be pretty polarizing. But again, this was very much to my taste. And as I'm looking at my list, we're just going to continue on with polarizing books that I was a fan of. Coming in at number 9 is The Lost Village by Camilla Sten. This is a translated work of horror written by a Swedish author, and I really liked it. It was one that I couldn't put down. I read this in like a day or two because I didn't want to stop reading. It had all the creepy atmosphere that I wanted. I can see why there's been some criticism of some of the twists in this book. It maybe didn't handle some issues of like the treatment of disability perfectly, for instance, but it just held my attention all the way through, and I thought that it was doing some really interesting things, and you know, even if it didn't do it perfectly, exploring some very interesting ideas. This book is about a small village in Europe where at some point, like 30 or 40 years in the past, something like that, the entire village had basically disappeared with a couple of exceptions, and nobody knew what happened to them. And now, all these years later, a documentary film crew, including the child of one of the survivors, is going back to try to figure out what happened. And things get weird. I do think this is a book where the more I read critical reviews of it after reading it, I was like, yeah, okay, I can see what you're saying with the ending. I can see what you're saying, but like, I just was so in it when I read it, I didn't care, you know? And I think that's really it, is like, does it bother you for there to be some sort of like Deus Ex Machina stuff used or things that you couldn't have guessed? Does it bother you when you have this kind of thing where like, is it supernatural or is it not? Does it bother you if it does end up having a supernatural twist? If those things are the case, then this book might not be for you. But if you don't mind that, I thought it was very riveting. But again, as with, I would say, probably all the books on this list, because of the genres we're talking about, if you do need any content warnings, check them out. I do often put some of the big ones in my Goodreads reviews, and my Goodreads is always linked in the video description down below if you want to check that out. Number 8 is The Maidens by Alex Michaelides. This is another one with a very polarizing ending, and one where I think he didn't necessarily telegraph what the twist was going to be throughout it, which I think really bothered some readers, and I get that. Again, though, this gave me all of those gothic, dark academia vibes. I was so sucked into the story. I thought some of the ideas it was trying to explore were interesting, if quite dark at times. And yeah, this just really worked for me. It's another one of those ones where, like, as I was reading it, I was like, oh my God, I literally yelled out loud when the twist happened because I didn't see it coming. I just had a great experience with this book. I did listen to this one on audio. I thought the audio narration was fantastic. But again, like, people disagree. My friend Alexa Dunn had this book on her worst books of the year list, so your mileage is really gonna vary, but I was a fan. Coming in at number 7 is My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. This was so my jam. I really loved it. It's super character-driven literary horror that is also a play on the slasher movie. It follows an indigenous teenage girl living in a small mountain town who is obsessed with slasher movies and is convinced that a slasher cycle is about to play out in her small town. This is a book that takes its time with the buildup. Again, it's very character driven, so you're going to spend a lot of the book really getting to know these characters, learning more about slashers, being inside this character's head as things slowly progress. And the pacing of this kind of mirrors what you would find in a slasher film, which I think is really interesting. This may not work for everybody, but it definitely worked for me. I loved the main character. I really loved Stephen Graham Jones's writing in this, and I am so excited we're getting a sequel that's set like several years down the road. I think it's going to be great. Number 6 is the only 2022 release on this list. I had an advanced copy of this January release and I read it in December. This is Real Easy by Marie Rutkoski. I was actually pretty surprised at how much I loved this and how stellar this really was. If you've heard of Marie Rutkoski before, you might know that she is a best-selling YA fantasy author, but this is her first adult novel and her first kind of mystery thriller. I guess you would say this is more mystery than thriller, but it falls in that kind of both category. It's a procedural murder mystery with a serial killer set mostly at a Midwestern strip club in the late 90s. It has multiple perspectives and characters, and I was just so impressed at the quality of this. It's well plotted and has an interesting mystery plot, but also the character work is very, very good. You really come to be invested in these characters and care what's happening to them, and it's a very human take on sex workers. One thing that I think is interesting is I had the audiobook for review, and at the end there was an interview with the author where she talked about how some of her inspiration for this book was her own experiences as a young 20-something working in a strip club for a few years. And I think you can tell that there's some personal experience because all of these women feel nuanced and fleshed out. I like this a lot. I thought it was very well done. I'm excited to see what else we get from Marie Rutkoski in the future if she continues to write in this subgenre. Yeah, definitely a fan. Number 5 is also literary horror. You might recognize this from the Goodreads Choice Awards under fantasy, but I would say this is not fantasy. It's definitely horror. This is Sorrowland by Rivers Solomon. So I loved this book. I think it is doing so many interesting things, and there's so much depth and nuance to this story that you can read into if you understand all of the different things that are being referenced. At a top level, it does have some fantastical paranormal elements to it. It's following a young woman. She's really a teenager, a pregnant teenager who is running away from a commune that was kind of like a cult into the forest where she gives birth to twin babies. And some weird stuff starts happening. I don't want to talk too much about this, but I think it's really fascinating. It is a book that is very black and very queer and quite dark, and I think does a really good job of handling the complexities of motherhood in a horror novel. I've read takes on that I didn't think were done very well, and I thought this was done quite well. Yeah, I don't know why this was in fantasy. I would definitely call this horror, but I thought it was incredibly well done and very nuanced. It's another one that I could see myself returning to in the future just because there are so many layers to the writing. It's creepy, but very good. Number 4 is actually a comic. This is The Lolo Woods by Carmen Maria Machado. I was a really big fan of this, and it's interesting because I think the reviews are pretty polarized if you read the reviews on Goodreads. And what's so fascinating to me, I know I've said this before, but I still find it really interesting, is that if you scroll through, In general, you'll mostly see women giving this like 4 and 5 stars and being like, this was so good, I loved it, it was like horrifying. And then it was mostly men that I was looking at giving it like 1 or 2 stars and being like, what was this? I don't get it. It wasn't actually scary. And I'm like, okay. So here's the thing. Carmen Maria Machado is a queer woman of color, and this is a horror comic that centers queer women of color and is scary for women. So I find the reviewing piece of this interesting, but I really loved it as a piece of horror. I think she does a good job of packing a lot into a pretty short space. The artwork really worked for me. The slow build-up really worked for me. I just generally love everything I've read from Carmen Maria Machado and will probably pick up whatever she decides to write. I thought this was fantastic. Number 3 is Summer Suns by Lee Mandello. So this is a book that I would call literary Southern Gothic horror. It is quiet and very character driven and follows messy characters who you're not necessarily going to like. It has a supernatural element to it. It's doing a lot of interesting things conceptually, and I kind of loved it. It was the kind of book that got under my skin. I started it and I was like, I don't know, why should I care about this? Why should I care about these characters? And then slowly but surely it just worked its way in, and by the end I was like, oh my god, I love this. I love this writing. I love what this book is doing. I think it's so interesting. It has a lot of depth to it. In many ways, this is a book about toxic masculinity and homophobia in the American South. It's also a book that tackles racism in American universities, and I just thought all of those elements were handled really well. Again, this is a slower paced book. It's got unlikable characters. It may not be everyone's cup of tea, but I really loved it. So if it sounds up your alley, maybe give it a shot. Coming into my number 2 and 1 spots are, again, very polarizing books. Like, there are people who hate these books and people who love these books. I happened to love them. Number 2 is The Other Black Girl by Zakiya Dalila Harris. This book is so interesting. It's another example of quiet literary horror. It's slow paced. It never gets super intense or graphic or over the top. It's this creeping horror that is intended to be unsettling. And a lot of people don't like the ending, but you're not supposed to like the ending. That's kind of the point. I can't say too much about it, but this follows a young Black woman who works in publishing. She is an editorial assistant and the only Black person working on her team until they hire another Black girl who maybe she feels like is better at being Black than she is, but things get weird. That's all I'm going to say about the plot, but I think this is a really fascinating book about respectability politics, about Black identity, about being Black in the workplace, especially in white-dominated spaces. And yeah, I think there's a reason that this book did so well. I think it's really fascinating and asking some interesting questions. It was one of my favorite picks of the year. And lastly, my most favorite book in these genres, and another book that some people really hate, is Catherine House by Elizabeth Thomas. I'm so glad I decided to give this book a try. I have some friends who like 1-starred this book, but I heard some reviews of it that made me interested, and I loved it. This book totally worked for me. It's, again, literary horror. What have I learned this year? I love literary horror. It is totally my thing, but this is Gothic literary horror. And one thing that I think is interesting about it is that our main character is pretty passive. I think that's intentional, and I think it's saying some interesting things about who she is as a person and about the university experience, but I do think there are a lot of readers who didn't like that. She goes to this secretive private university where some strange things are happening, and I don't want to say too much about this book, but one thing that I would recommend is if you have read this, at the end, go and look up what this book is retelling, because it is actually a retelling of something. I'm not going to say what it is because I feel like if you know going in what it's retelling, your expectations might negatively affect your reading experience. But if after you read it, you go and look up what it was retelling, I feel like it puts the ending and what it's doing in a whole new light. And I think it's kind of a brilliant book in what it's doing. I loved this. I hope we get more from Elizabeth Thomas in the future. This was her debut and so far she hasn't put anything else out, but I would love to read more from her. This totally worked for me. There they are, my favorite horror, mystery, and thriller novels that I read in 2021. Talk to me in the comments down below. Let me know any of your thoughts or feelings on anything I talked about in this video. I know I have some polarizing faves, as we have discussed. But for your question of the day, I would love to hear what is one of your favorite horror, mystery, or thriller books that you read in 2021. And if it is a polarizing book, which, you know, let's be real, a lot of books in these genres are, if yours is polarizing, feel free to leave it below. If it's not, and you just want to share a favorite that everybody loves or that you think doesn't get enough attention, feel free to leave that in the comments below as well. If you guys like this video, it helps if you give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next time.